everyone. I'm John Evans. Welcome to another episode of One-on-One. Tom Clancy had sold 100 million books and had written 17 best-selling thrillers before he died 10 years ago this year. Since then, authors like Don Bentley have continued to breathe new life into Tom Clancy's characters. Bentley's latest release, featuring Jack Ryan Jr., is called Weapons Grade, and it debuted this month at number 8 on the New York Times bestseller list. This is going to be Bentley's last Clancy world thriller, at least for the foreseeable future, because that chapter of his writing career is closing while another one is set to open. The former Army Apache helicopter pilot is going to take over writing for another legendary character, Vince Flynn's Mitch Rapp. Now, all this is happening just a few short years after Don Bentley bet on himself and won. Don Bentley, the former Army Apache helicopter pilot, FBI special agent, and SWAT team member, is joining us from his home in Texas. Don, welcome to the One-on-One with John Evans podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
It seems like a natural fit, a former military chopper pilot writing a thriller about a top secret air asset that could fall into the wrong hands. And that's what's behind Weapons Grade. Where did you come up with the story, Don?
Yeah, it's funny. So that's my 8th book. I've worked together on the same, with the same editor. And so I'm very fortunate. My editor is a great guy named Tom Colgan, who actually edited for Janet Ivanovich and Lee Child and Tom Clancy when Tom was still alive. And so Tom Colgan and I have worked on 4 Clancy books together and then 4 of my Matt Drake series. And when I got done with my 3rd book, so this year's a little bit strange, even for my standards, in that I have 3 books that came out. So Forgotten War, the 4th in my Matt Drake series, and then Flashpoint, the Clancy, and then Weapons Grade. And when I got done with Flashpoint, I told my editor, Tom, I said, I think I just want to write a little story about a small town in Texas. My son goes to Texas A&M. I spend a lot of time driving through these small towns, and in each small town has a Pizza Hut, a Dairy Queen, and a brand new credit union. And I'm like, why do they have that brand new credit union? What's going on there? And so that's the book I sat down to write. And then as I was writing it, kind of current events crept in. And so I started thinking about Iran, and at the same, I'm a huge aviation geek, and there's this incredible startup company called Hermeus that's trying to make a hypersonic jet airplane, and are doing some really great work. And I just ended up pulling that all in. And part of the way that I pulled that in is on the Hermeus podcast, they had this great a guy named Bob Beeler, who's a retired Air Force general who flew 65 different planes, was a test pilot, and he flew the SR-71. And so I heard him talking about it, and I'm like, I have got to find a way to put that in the book. So after doing an interview with Bob, it all kind of came together, much to my editor's chagrin, because again, he was expecting the small town Texas book.
Well, you got the small town Texas vibe and you've got the military vibe kind of wound into one. To tell you the God's honest truth, Don, as the story began, I'm like, okay, how is this going to all fit together? And then as you go deeper, you see a couple of different aspects come into play. Were you a fan of the earlier Jack Ryan Jr. novels from the time Mr. Clancy started writing back in 2004 with Teeth of the Tiger before you began writing them?
Yeah, and so Tom Clancy brought me to this genre even before he was writing the Jack Ryan Jr. books. A lot of people talk about Hunt for the Red October as their first Clancy book. Mine was actually Red Storm Rising, and there was a scene in Red Storm Rising, which was the only Clancy standalone book, in which there's an F-14 doing this strafing run on this Russian cargo ship. And I just remember reading that and putting it down, and like, I felt like I was in the cockpit of that. And I would love to be able to write books that make people feel the same way. So fast forward to when Tom Clancy started writing Jack Ryan Jr.'s, I was definitely a fan of them. I'm lucky enough to have Mark Graney as one of my friends rather. I'm one of his fans, and he was the first guy to write to continue the series once Tom passed away, and actually wrote some with him. And so I leaned on Mark quite a bit when I started writing these series, because he kind of helped shape that whole Jack Ryan Jr. character that we've all fallen in love with now.
Did you talk to him a lot about understanding the character that he crafted? And then Mike Madden did a couple of
Yep.
books as well. So, I mean, you've got your standalone Matt Drake. And
Sure.
I guess one of the things I've always asked, and I asked Mark about this a little bit when I talked to him, is you're really taking somebody else's character and moving it
Yep.
forward. So
Yep.
you've got to really understand how they developed it to start, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike Madden was fantastic too. As you said, he wrote 4 books before I came in, and he was great with helping me with everything I needed. But Mark, I went back to when I was first talking about or thinking about taking the job. My editor said, talk to Mark, he'll shoot you straight and tell you what it was really like. And so Mark at first was actually saying, I'm not going to tell you to take this job because I want you to understand everything that goes into it and what the fans' expectations are and what you're doing. And at the end of the phone call, he was like, you have to take this job. And so one of the things that we talked about, I'm like, how did you get your head around this character? Do you have a Bible or, some kind of document? And he said, I don't have a Bible, but I'll send you what I have. And so what he sent me was Tom Clancy's Dead or Alive. That's about that thick. And on the binding of it are little Post-it notes in multiple colors, probably 100 of them, where every time a character was described, everything Mark thought was important, he put in there. And so I'm a firm believer in capitalism. And I had a 13-year-old daughter, and I gave it to her. And I said, I will pay you $20 an hour to go through and create kind of a Bible of that. And so she did. And between those two things, as you said, you kind of get the sense of the character. Right. But I think the other thing you want to do when you're writing a series is figure out, you have to walk that line between giving folks what they want, but not making it episodic. And so what I tried to do is find a little patch of dirt that nobody else had tilled yet and say, what can I do over what became my 4-book arc to kind of move the series forward?
When I'm reading and preparing for the interview, there's one spot in here that I marked where you use 3 different descriptions inside of 2 pages about how a cell phone goes off. And you, at one point in time, you called it like a rattlesnake. The iPhone thumbed like an angry rattlesnake. And then you said in here, you started talking about it chimed once again in the cup holder. Do you have to walk a line in, okay, everybody's phone goes off at some point in time. Do you have to walk a line as to being too descriptive or just saying the iPhone churned again? I mean, I was fascinated by that. I was like, 2 pages, there's 3 different ways of saying the same thing.
I appreciate you saying that. And that's just that question writ large is one of the things that Clancy was famous for, more around technical detail and the amount of pages he would dedicate to explaining how something works. And my editor said a lot of good things to me when I first took the job to kind of bolster my confidence. But one of the things that helped the most is he said, you are not Tom Clancy. Nobody can be Tom Clancy. And I don't want you to try and write like he did. I just want you to kind of write fan fiction in his universe. And so I think as you're writing, and this one I was almost 500 pages, I believe. It was one of my bigger entries. And I still get emails from people saying it was a great book, but it was too short. When are you going to write a longer one? And I'm choosing to take that as a compliment, meaning it went by really fast. And so I don't know what else to do. But I think you have to walk that line between too much description and not enough. And if you don't have enough, description is what allows readers to find themselves in the story, to place things and make it more than just words. And so I appreciate you saying that. As you read it out loud, I was like, I should have cut one of those. I shouldn't have used one of those. And so I appreciate it.
No, but the thing of it was, I found it fascinating in that you used the rattlesnake term, but he's in Texas. So it coins to the area where he's at. But all 3 I could hear in my mind at one point in time. So I just To me, it was a great piece of writing, and I love good writing. I mean, I write in 30-second or a minute and 30-second
Sure.
stories here, but I love good writing and I love good lines, and I felt like that was just an excellent just description of something that all of us have happen, that you took three different ways of describing it. Another funny line, Jad and Carrie at one point talking to Lassand, Jad says, true or false, when we work with Jack, the body count goes up exponentially. Is it, do you have to kind of keep the line going as to what everybody wants from a Jack Ryan novel?
Well, I think what you're trying to do is walk the line between believability and a great story. And so part of it, when people ask me about details and stuff, I say, there are some things that you have to get right because the readers expect it, and they expect it of a Clancy book. On the other hand, you are writing fiction, and you're going to stretch the limits of what people will believe because it's supposed to be a story. And so I think one of the ways that you can kind of talk about the elephant in the room, if you will, is if you have characters kind of make fun of that fact. And so the fact that a lot of people usually die when Jack Ryan is involved in a story is kind of intrinsic to the story, but also they're like, man, what is this guy's body count? And so Jad and Carrie, the two Green Berets, were two characters that I brought into existence in my first book, Target Acquired, and never really expected that they would become part of the series, but they were so much fun, and the fans loved them, and they were allowed me to interject a little humor in the books that weren't there before. And so that's what I have them do a lot. Is it's really interesting. Like, you have an idea what Jack Ryan looks like, I do, but it's always interesting to see what he seems like and is from other characters' perspective. And so I was doing a little bit of that with that line.
Many of the thriller genres have an anti-American villain, antagonist.
Yeah.
In this one, though, the antagonist is not necessarily, without trying to give away too much here, is not necessarily anti-American. And late in the book, you give Peter some justification for what he's doing. He's not driven for hate of America. It's family related. It's health issues for his wife. It's better life for his family. Why? Is that just a difference that you wanted to take with this one book?
Yeah. So when I was doing, I wish I could say that my research for the book follows a very linear path. It more often follows kind of rabbit trails. Well, I'll get interested in something and it'll lead to something else and it'll lead to something else. And so South African mercenaries play a big role in this book. And as I was researching, I kept coming up on these articles where it was talking about the majority of these men were in their 50s and older, and they were doing it because they had no other choice, where either they'd been purged out of the South African military, they didn't feel like they had any other applicable skills. And so many of these folks who were in their prime, one of the things South Africa is known for is producing mercenaries who fight in conflicts all across Africa, is this sense of an aging army, an aging cadre of men who nobody is taken care of, who no longer, these aren't rich guys. If they were, they wouldn't still be going head to head with dictators or whatever they're doing in their 50s or 60s. And so I started thinking about that. And I thought about when I was lucky enough to serve in the military, my last or second to last assignment was as a troop commander, and what you get taught over and over again as an officer in the Army is that your job is to take care of soldiers. Your job is to take care of the sons and daughters who have been entrusted to you. And so I started thinking, I'm like, what would a guy who had this cadre of kind of broken down has-beens, once been mercenaries, what would he do to take care of his soldiers? And that's where that plot line kind of came from.
I once heard Tom Clancy in an interview describe Jack Ryan Sr. as a reluctant hero, a reluctant politician. And he said once, sort of like a Cary Grant or a Jimmy Stewart in a Hitchcock movie, kind of dropped into the chaos and having to fight himself out of it. Is that how you see Junior?
Yeah, I do. I think when I was talking to Mark Graney about Jack Ryan Jr., like I said, and trying to get my head wrapped around him, I'm like, how do you see him at kind of a visceral level? And he's like, he's a younger version of his dad. That's what he is. Like he at least aspires to be a younger version of his dad. And to your point, I think Jack Ryan Sr. he epitomizes kind of that Cincinnatus mentality of, I didn't ask for this. I didn't. And literally, and I think it was Dead of Honor is where he becomes president the first time at the end of the book, after there's that cataclysmic attack, which was eerily like September 11th.
Right.
Is that he is not doing it for money or for power or anything. He's literally doing it because he thinks he has something to offer his country still, and he wants to serve. And I think the son is very much like that too. And that's part of, we talked a little bit about what I tried to achieve over my book arc, and there was a lot of that where I wanted to bend him more towards his dad, and to be kind of take stock of where he is in his life, where his father was in his life at that time. And I think all sons want to be their fathers. All sons want to emulate their fathers. And so it's a very interesting thing for me to try and explore across those books.
After a career of piloting military helicopters, deploying to Afghanistan, receiving a Bronze Star and an Air Medal for valor, working with the FBI, and being a SWAT team member, you would think a guy might want to relax a little bit, but not Don Bentley. You went into the thriller genre. Why in the world did you want to start writing after everything
Yeah.
that you had done, and really not take a step back and relax a little bit?
Yeah, it's funny when you look at my resume that way. First of all, it seems like I actually knew what I was doing. What my wife likes to tell people is I couldn't decide what I wanted to be when I grew up, and there's some truth to that. But I always wanted to be a writer. When I started writing when I was in elementary school. I remember seeing television shows and imagining what would have been like if they would have done something different, and writing that out. And so I started my first book, I think, when I was in high school, and finished my first book while I was still in the military. I wrote my second book while I was deployed to Afghanistan. And so to me, those were not either ors. And there are very few people who are fortunate enough to be able to write for a living. And I didn't honestly imagine that would be me. And so for me, it wasn't so much. And that was another great piece. Brad Taylor is also a great friend of mine. He writes the Pike Logan series, and both Mark Graney and Brad Taylor for a while wrote 2 books a year, which I did. And so Mark, when I had the opportunity to write these Clancy books, I had my series on the time, and I still had a day job. And I was asking Mark, I'm like, how did you know when to go full time, or what it was like? And he said, in this business, the work is usually there before the money is, meaning that as a young writer starting out, your advances really aren't enough for you to write full time unless you're very, very fortunate. And so you kind of have to take a bet on yourself and say, okay, is there enough work there? Do I feel like eventually my advances will get to the point where I can write full time? And one of the things that Mark said is that when you get an opportunity to write for a legacy series like the Clancy series or the Bourne series, or now I get to write for the Vince Flynn series, it's kind of like the publishing industry putting their stamp on you and saying, this person can write. And he said, I'm not guaranteeing you a life of riches, but what I'm saying is you will probably have the work if you're willing to bet on yourself. And so that's kind of where it finally came to me. I held on as long as I could, trying to do a day job and writing. And then when it got to the point where I couldn't do both, I took a gamble and bet on myself, and it paid off.
What happened to those first 2 books that you wrote? The one you wrote in high school, and then the one you wrote in the military?
Yeah, so there are actually three books that nobody ever cared about. So the one in high school I didn't finish, but I wrote 2 in the military. Both were good enough to get agents, but neither were good enough to sell. And so then I wrote a 3rd book, and thought this was going to be it for sure. And it didn't sell either. And there was quite a bit of soul searching there. I was, as I said, I was working full time, and I thought, am I wasting my time here? I've got young kids. Is is this really? And I had the great fortune of meeting another fantastic writer, Nick Petrie, who does the Drifter series. And we met at a writers conference, and it was supposed to be about a 5-minute conversation. And an hour and a half later, I've got my head in his lap and I'm like, I'm never going to be a writer. And he said something that was very pivotal to me. And he said, "You're me 2 years ago." He said, "I wrote 3 books that didn't sell. Go home and write a better book." And I did. And that was the one that sold. And so if you discount those 3 books and the 17 years it took me to write them, I'm pretty much an overnight success.
What led you to the military? Where did you grow up, and what was your career desire, and why did you join the military?
Yeah, so I grew up in Ohio, about midway between Cincinnati and Dayton, and I like to say that I am the first member of my family who voluntarily served in the military. So my grandfather was drafted for World War II, my father was drafted for Vietnam, but I was a kid of the 80s. I grew up in the Cold War, where it was not a abstract concept to think that nuclear missiles might come streaking down. Or I remember being a kid when the movie Red Dawn came out, and you look back at it now and kind of chuckle, but at the end you're like, maybe that could happen. Maybe that would be real. And so I wanted to serve in the military. I grew up knowing I wanted to do that. And when it came to my branch of service, I wanted to do something in the military that I knew nobody would ever let me do if I wasn't in the military. And so my dad was an engineer, but also had his pilot's license on the side. And so I'd grown up kind of flying with him and knew I wanted to fly. He had also looked at going into the Air Force and trying to be a pilot, but his vision got worse his senior year in college. And so I thought, if I can't be a pilot in the Air Force, I don't know what else there is to do. But if I can't be a pilot in the Army, man, they've got all kinds of fun things to do. And so I ended up getting an Army ROTC scholarship, and then going to school and getting a degree in electrical engineering, and then flying Apache gunships for 10 years.
When you're flying those gunships, and I know you went to Afghanistan,
Yeah.
when you're in downrange and you're in mission,
Yeah.
Is there a lot of fear in what you did there?
Yeah, so I think there's two types of fear. So the first fear is, are you going to be good enough to do the job that you need to do when it counts? And so for us flying Apaches, one of the things that we did in Afghanistan that was completely different from what we'd grown up training. Again, the Apache came into existence, and it was a Cold War piece of equipment that was meant to stop the Russian armored horde coming through the Fulda Gap, right? And so what that meant is you were going to hover 6 or 7 kilometers away and loft missiles into Russian tanks. In Afghanistan, we're fighting guys with RPGs and AK-47s. And so you're doing a lot more of what we call the over-the-shoulder attacks or close combat attacks, which means you're popping up, nosing over, and shooting rockets over the heads of good guys at bad guys. And so when you do that for the first time, there's very much a feeling of, oh my goodness, this is for real. If I mess this up, I'm going to kill Americans. And so that's a very heavy responsibility. When it comes to getting shot at least from my perspective, you're certainly scared. But I think where the training came in is when I got shot at and things went off the rails completely, there's a moment in time where you're going through the OODA loop and you're trying to think, how is this happening? How is this me right now? How, what am I going to do? And I remember a guy popped up and shot an RPG at us, and my front seater said, "We're taking fire." And those words were exactly the right thing to say, because in the simulator, you practice that over and over again. And the crew member says you're taking fire, and then you just react to it. And so that allowed me to transition from I was still certainly scared, but now it felt familiar. Now it felt something, okay, we trained to do this, so I know what to do next, and you get on with it. And I think anybody that tells you they're not scared is probably lying.
What was the transition like from military life to civilian life for you? As I've talked to a lot of, obviously doing stories on veterans over the years, and we hear a lot about the transition being difficult. Jack Carr, as I've talked to Jack over the years, does a lot of work helping veterans make an easier and better transition. What was it like for you?
So it was really hard as well, but not for the reasons I would have expected. And what I tell veterans now, especially veterans, that there aren't as many anymore because the war on terror has effectively ended, is that when you get to go do your job in combat for real, and you come home and you leave the military, what you don't realize is how much of who you are is wrapped up in what you did. That's how you define yourself. I was a cavalry officer. I was a gunship pilot. That's what I did, and that's who I was. And the second thing I don't think you realize is how much worth you put in the notion that you're doing something, you're a part of something that's bigger than you, and you're doing something that's noble. And those things are hard to find in the civilian world, not because they don't exist, but because, the example I use, one of my best friends to this day worked for Procter and Gamble, and he sold diapers. And I have 3 kids. I am a big fan of diapers, but I needed something that was more tied to what I did before, that I felt like still mattered to the men and women who were going into harm's way on my behalf, than selling diapers. And so those are the 2 things I say a lot. And then the third part is, if you're carrying any baggage from the military, which most people who have gone into combat are, when you leave the military and you go back home, you become a civilian again, what you're inadvertently doing is separating yourself from the only community of people who actually understands what you've gone through. Mm-hmm. And so as you're wrestling with the things like a sense of purpose, sense of identity, kind of those things in your rucksack where moments in time went wrong and maybe people died, and you're trying to reckon with those, you don't have anybody around you who can speak into that, because you've cut yourself off from the community of people who understand. And so, the analogy that I use is, God forbid you get diagnosed with stage 4 cancer tomorrow. The first person you're going to want to talk to is somebody who was also diagnosed with cancer and who beat it. And they aren't going to have anything magical to tell you, but you know that they've been where you've been and have come out on the other side, and there's power in that. And I think that those things together are what I tell folks most often when they transition.
Between the job as the helicopter pilot, the FBI special agent, working as a SWAT team member, none of those are sitting behind a desk, pushing paper.
Yeah.
You always wanted to write, but those are 3 jobs, I would take it, that you really need to concentrate on fully. And so was writing always still there? And did you have to control that urge to want to do it while you're working as an FBI special agent or doing your SWAT duties?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like I said, when I wrote my second book in Afghanistan, and so I'd get home from missions, a lot of guys would go watch movies or play video games or whatever. I'd open up my laptop and start writing. When I was an FBI special agent and SWAT team guy, I would write in the morning before I went to work, or late at night afterwards. And I think for me, those worlds weren't really that separate. So the protagonist in my Matt Drake movies is a former Army Ranger who is a case officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency. And when I was doing media interviews for Without Sanction, I had an interviewer ask me, and it was like she was going to pin me to the wall. And she said, "Are you Matt Drake?" And I said, I am absolutely Matt Drake, but I've not Matt Drake, but I've stood in the same room with men who could be. And so I feel like the experience I got serving in the military and the FBI, and then after the FBI, where I worked for companies whose customers were primarily in the special operations or intelligence communities, I got to understand the men, and in some cases women, who could be characters in my book at a very visceral level. And so for me, I've been fortunate enough that I never really had to see those 2 worlds as separate. I wrote in a genre that was very complementary of my day job and vice versa.
Well, I guess I can cross off the "is Matt Drake your alter ego" question that I was going to get to here. But when it comes time then for you to make the decision to give writing that try full time, I've always talked that I wouldn't be anywhere near as successful without my wife, Sheila. I mean, I married a saint, basically, for all the hours I've had to work. Many who are in the business like yourself, the Jack Carrs, the Brad Thors, also give so much praise to their other half. What was that conversation like with your wife? What was that like to give up that paycheck that you were getting every day to bet on Dawn being a best-selling
Yeah.
author?
So she's fantastic. We were actually high school sweethearts. So we had started dating when she was 16 and I was 17. And so she's known me for the majority of my life and knows who I am. She's my first reader of my books. In my Matt Drake series, Matt's wife, Lila, doesn't look anything like my wife, but is my wife for all intents and purposes. And so when I first got offered what would become Target Acquired, my first Clancy book, my editor kind of threw it on me at the end of this conversation in a very Columbo-esque moment where he's like, one more thing, would you like to write for Tom Clancy? And it's like you hear this, like, what did he just say? And then, and so I got off and I told my wife, and originally I said, I'm very flattered, but there's no way I can do it. And she's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, look, here's where it's going to pay. It isn't, I at the time had a great day job and was very successful at it. And I'm like, there's no way this is the smart financial decision to try and write both of these books, because it'll mean I've got to write full time and the money's not there. We've got 3 kids that are going to college, and she's like, family meeting, and calls the kids in, and they're like, Dad has the opportunity to write for Tom Clancy and he doesn't want to do it. And so it was, she was awesome, because what we came back to is like, look, for the next 6 months, I'm going to try and keep my day job and write, and we'll reassess. And I was holding it together for a while, and then the wheels were just coming off. I was going to be late on my book, and I felt like I wasn't doing my day job well. I wasn't doing my writing job well. I wasn't doing my dad or husband jobs well. And so I said, I don't think I can do it anymore. And she's like, well, then go full time. This is, we've fortunately, again, talking to guys like Mark and Brad, I had saved every bit of my writing money that I could. Because I knew, coming from them, that again, you're probably going to have to take the work before the money's there. You're probably going to have to bankroll yourself for a while to do that. And thankfully we had saved enough. We were in a position where I could. In the first year, it was kind of sketchy, because writing, you're paid off of milestones, and those milestones can slide left and right, sometimes through no fault of your own. And so it could be that there was a major payment you were expecting that gets slid into the next year, and you're like, oh my gosh, how do I deal with that? And so she was fantastic for it, and has been nothing but supportive and writing. And I wouldn't be a writer without her. Without a doubt, I wouldn't, because she's the one I tell stories for, and it'd be no fun to tell a story if I didn't know she was going to read it.
How did you get Without Sanction published? What's the story of? I know your editor helped you and got you a 2-book deal, and then got you into the Clancy world, but how did you do it? I mean, I've heard stories of people doing manuscripts inside a pizza box and delivering it on somebody's desk, but what was your story?
Yep. Yeah, so thankfully you don't have to. Usually the pizza box story is more about Hollywood and screenplay writers there. Thankfully the novel writing and the community in general is so much more welcoming and stuff from people that I've heard that have worked both. But there's a great writers conference called Thriller Fest that was originally founded by like Lee Child and Steve Barry and Heather Graham and just luminaries of the genre. And so I had gone to that for a number of years, and they have something as part of Thriller Fest. It's called Pitch Fest, and it's kind of like speed dating for writers, where all these agents. So the way you sell a book, if you're traditionally published, which means one of the big 5 publishing things, is you write a book, you get an agent, and then your agent sells your book. And so in order to get an agent, you can write out query letters and stuff, and that is really hard. And you could write hundreds of query letters, or you could go to something like Thriller Fest, where you get to speed date with agents, and they're basically talking to you, talk about your book, and they might say, okay, go ahead and send me 3 chapters. And if they like the 3 chapters, they'll ask for the whole book. And if they ask for the whole book, then they'll decide if they want to represent you or not. And so I knew it was actually Nick Petrie's agent. I knew the woman that I wanted to be my agent. I pitched a whole bunch of ones. And so she said, okay, send me your book. And it was my 3rd book. And she read it, and she's like, not this one. She's like, you're a good writer, but this isn't the book. You need to go home and write a better book. And that was really hard for me to hear. And I took a couple years to sulk about it before I went home and wrote a better book. And then once that book was done, she and I had stayed friends. We still met. We had most of her client, or some of her clients were my friends as well. And so when I finished it, I said, I'm sending this just to you, because you're the one I want to be my agent. And so she read it and loved it, and had some great comments for revisions that we worked on together. And then once she's satisfied, they do what's called taking it out to editors. And so you kind of get a list between the two of you, or who do you think would buy. And so for me, because I'd spent so long in this genre as a fan, I knew the editors that I wanted to work with because they published the writers that I loved. And so Tom Colgan was one of them. I actually knew him a little bit on Twitter. And so I said to my agent, I said, hey, before you send it to Tom, let me reach out to him over Twitter and just tell him it's coming. And I did. And he was very gracious. And so he wrote back and he said, hey, I'm going on vacation for a week, but I will read it as soon as I get back. And I was very grateful to him. Unbeknownst to me, he lied to me and actually grabbed the book and took it with him on vacation. And when he came back, he made an offer on it. And so it was, a lot of times when people take their books out, it can last months or sometimes even a year. Ours lasted 7 days. And so he made an offer within 7 days, and he bought that and then a second book in it, like I said, in a 2-book deal. And then we've gone on from there.
What year was that Thriller Fest you went to? Do you remember?
So I think he bought the book in 2018, but I had gone to Thriller Fest. I think the first one I went to was probably 2012 or 2013. So I went for 4 or 5 years before
so it was a long
I did
process
anything.
of you attending.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And you get, your first one you go to and you have a book and you're like, this is it. I've arrived. I've done. And then when you don't place that, it's a lot harder to come back the next year or the year after that or the year after that. And that was another one where I'm like, am I just wasting my time here? Am I ever going to sell a book? Do I even have what it takes? And it's a hard one. There are, David McCluskey is a great friend of mine. I think Damascus Station is one of the best debuts I've ever read, period. And he wrote his first book and sold his first book, but most of us are not David McCluskey's. I think Mark Graney, I know he wrote 3 or 4 books before he wrote Gray Man. And so the more people have to write a couple books to be able to get good enough to sell it. And I think a lot of authors hang on to that first book or two too much, and you got to let it go and write a better book.
What kind of writer are you? Again, in some of the interviews that I've done, I know Jack Carr sits down and he's got an outline. I know Brad Thor just sits down at the laptop and just lets it go. Another friend of mine, Wiley Cash, actually hand wrote his last book because he wanted it to flow that way, and then went and put it in to computer form. How does Don address empty page 1 and go?
With sheer terror. That is how I address empty page 1. So I think most writers are broken into 2 groups, and you call them plotters or pantsers. And so the plotters are like, as you mentioned, Jack Carr, or I'm taking over Vince Flynn from Kyle Mills. Kyle is famous for writing these extremely 30 or 40 or 50,000 word outlines before he goes to write the book. I'm in the pantser or the organic side, where I kind of have an idea where I start, and I'm telling myself the story as I write it. And so you have to do the work either way. You either do it ahead of time with the outline, or if you write like I do, you do multiple revisions as you work, because you're starting, you learn something, 3/4 of the way through the book that affects all of the earlier things. And there's no shortcut to the work. And there's also, from what I'm seeing, if you're a plotter, you can't make yourself write as a pantser organically, and vice versa. I've tried many, many times to think, I'll just outline this book, I'll figure it out. And it just doesn't work. That's one of the kind of the mysteries of the creative process, I guess.
Well, your Matt Drake series is fantastic. I've read all 4. The Ryan books that I've read, and now you've mentioned a couple of times taking over Mitch Rapp. And it has been one of my favorite characters, along with Scott Harvath, Brad Thor's character. But how do you go from one to the other? I would, to me, it just seems like when you're cranking out 2, or like you did this year, 3 books, Do you
Yep.
have different rooms in the house? Okay, this is my Drake room. This is my Ryan room. The garage is going to be my Rapp room. Because I would imagine
Yeah.
a lot of them have their contacts in DC. A lot of them have their
Yeah.
overseas people. How do you
Yeah.
separate them in your own mind?
I like that idea. I'm going to pitch that to my wife and say, I need a couple more offices because I need to have a different office for each character. And so I had 3 books come out this year, but that has been about 2.5 years in the making. And so my editor put me on every 5 months, you have to write a book so that this year 3 could come out. But to answer your question, really early on when I was talking to Mark Graney about it, he said, don't try and write 2 different books at the same time. And he's like,
Okay.
because part of the magic of it is that if you're embedded in that story, then you're walking the dog or you're at the gym and your subconscious is still working on it and it's solving problems or answering questions you don't need to that you don't even know that you have yet. You're working on it. And so the way that it works for me, or was easier with my first 2 books, is that Matt Drake this is a little bit of writer speak, but I write him as first person, which means Matt is telling you the story. You're in his head.
Right.
And so it was easy for me to switch from Matt to Jack Ryan Jr. because he's third person and that you're watching him learn the story. Now, having said that, it was very, very advantageous to have the same editor for both books, because my first Jack Ryan book, there were parts where my editor came back and he said, this isn't how he would talk. This is Matt Drake right here. You have to back this out. And so I have a friend his name's John Deacon. He writes incredible Westerns, and he was also a Golden Glove boxer. And he told me that the point of a referee in the boxing match is to worry about your opponent so you don't have to. And so you never have to worry about hurting your opponent. You just fight as hard as you can and let the referee take care of your opponent. And I think a good editor is the same way. And so I was really nervous about that the first book or 2, but by our 8th book together, I know that I can just write as crazy and as hard as I can. And Tom will help me. He'll be the guardrails for me and bring me back in and help me do that. And so it was, like I said, it was hard at first to do it with Mitch Rapp. So Vince Flynn is my favorite all-time writer. I love his books. And was, like a lot of people, really anxious when he died, for the obvious reasons that it was a tragedy. He was only 47 years old, but also
Right.
as a fan, I thought, can anybody pick up his mantle? Can Kyle did it? And Kyle has done a fantastic job. But I've made a concerted effort for the last 4 or 5 months. I really haven't read anything but Vince Flynn books. And so just trying to soak myself in that character. And then part of it, and it's been a lot more daunting, to be honest with you, to write his books than the Clancy, because for one reason, there were so many writers who came before me in the Clancy books. The fans were much more accepting of it. Like they knew, yep,
Right.
it can be done. You can do that. The other thing is that Clancy books have 2 books a year that come out. And so there's another fantastic writer, Mark Cameron, who would write the Jack Ryan Sr. And so I didn't feel like I was carrying the entire franchise myself. With the Flynn books, there's only 1 book, and there's only been 1 writer, Kyle, since Vince died. And so the reaction from the fans has been much more intense. And when they announced it, everybody was supportive, but all the messages I got was some variant of, glad to have you aboard, but this is my favorite series in the world. Do not screw this up. And I understand, because I felt the same way, but it's certainly a little more daunting to get behind the keyboard and write that series.
That was going to ask you about, I know it's got to be a different set of pressures because this is a
Yeah.
whole new character that you're taking on for Don Bentley now, is what I mean.
Yeah.
Matt was born out of your
Yep.
experiences and your mind, and you learned about Jack Ryan Jr., but this is a whole
Yeah.
new ball game for you.
It's a whole new ball game, and that was really driven home. So last week I spent 3 days traveling with Kyle, and we did a bunch of joint book events together. And so the second event was called Once Upon a Crime. It's this little bookstore in Minneapolis, in Vince's hometown. And so Vince's first book, Term Limits, he self-published originally. And I guess he was a bit of a charmer. And so he would go to bookstores and say, hey, put this book on your shelf. And so for Once Upon a Crime, he went in there and he said, if you put my book on this shelf, when I make it big, I'll launch every book tour out of here. And I'm sure at the time, the owner's like, whatever, kid. But sure enough, he did. And so we still do. And so you walk into this store and it was standing room only. There were probably 80, 85 people in there. It's a
Nice.
little room. It was packed. And so when I started the event, I said, raise your hand if you've driven an hour or more to be here. And probably 25 people raised their hand. And I kept going up until I got to the 5 hour mark. And there were people who had flown from Georgia, who had come from Chicago, who had come from either Nebraska or the Dakotas, because this series and that author mean that much to them. And it's fantastic as a writer, but it's also, like I said, it feels pretty heavy to say what you're coming into, people love. And you don't. Josh Hood is a great writer, is a friend of mine. He writes in the Bourne series, and he said, getting asked to write in one of these legacy series is kind of like your dad finally tossing you the keys to his classic 65 Mustang. And so you want to drive that car as fast as it'll go, but you want to bring it home with no new dings in the fender. And so that's what I'm trying to do with the Flynn series.
Does the process of writing a book get easier with each one you do, Don?
You would think it would get easier, but it really doesn't. I think it gets easier from the standpoint, it's possible. And it's kind of like I've run a couple marathons. And when you run the first marathon, it's like, can I even finish this? Can I run 26.2 miles? And so when you run the second marathon, there's a point about the 20-mile mark where the wheels are going to come off the train and it's going to hurt. And it's good. But you also know you can get to the other side, but it doesn't make that pain any less as you're experiencing it. And so from a writing perspective, I think where it gets harder, I was talking to Brad Taylor, and I think he's written maybe 17 full-length novels plus at least that many novellas. And he said, what I was asking him about ideas, is it harder to come up with ideas? And he said, not only is it harder to come up with ideas, but anything that I write that feels easy, like I'm going to do a shootout scene in a car, it feels easy because I probably already did it in another book and I'm subconsciously coming back to that. And so I think that's the hard part, is how do you tell a story that gives the fans what they want, but number two, isn't episodic, doesn't feel like I'm a kid, like I said, of the 80s. And it was really fun watching my kids discover the amazing television of that era. And for about a week, my kids were all into the A-Team, and then they quit. And I'm like, why? There are more episodes. And my son was like, well, the same thing happens every single episode. And you're like, yeah, I kind of get that. And so part of that, you want to give the fans what you want, but then the other part is, how do you still tell a story that surprises them? How do you make them think this might be the book that Mitch Rapp doesn't walk away from, right? And so I think that's your job as an author, is to still entertain them while not being episodic or repetitive. And it's a hard job, and it doesn't get any easier the more books that you write.
I can't let a New York Times best-selling author go without giving some advice. If there's a young man or a young lady out there listening to this podcast now, what's your piece of advice to someone who wants to put their idea onto the page?
Yeah, you should do it. But in order to be a writer, you have to do two things. You have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. And so when somebody tells me I want to be a writer and say I want to be a thriller writer, I say, okay, great. What are the 3 books that your book should be shelved next to? What are the 3 best-selling books right now that your book should be shelved next to? And if they can't tell me that, it always kind of raises a red flag. So if you're going to write commercial fiction, you have to understand your audience and give them, who are your customers, and give them the product that they want. And so what I mean by that is, the same person can love mysteries or romance and love the kind of books that I write. But if they get a book out of the romance section, they're going to have different expectations than if they get a book out of the thriller section. And if you as the writer don't understand the expectations of your customer, it's going to be really, really hard for you to write a book that resonates with them. And the way you understand your customer is you read the things that they read. And so, for me, like I said, Brad Taylor and Mark Graney are big, big influences on me. And so I knew that my book should be shelved with theirs. But then the second part of that equation is, my editor says you have to do something that's the same but different. So I'm never going to write a better Brad Taylor book than Brad writes. So my book should be next to his, but I've got to do something different in my books than he does. And the only way I'll be able to make those choices is if I've read Brad Taylor and AJ Tata and Brad Thor and Vince Flynn and understand what everybody else is doing, so that when I make my different choice, it's done by choice instead of kind of happenstance. And so that's kind of my very long-winded advice for writers.
Well, you've already had 3 books come out this year. I imagine you, judging by this hour-long conversation, you're probably going to take 10 minutes and breathe and then get started on something else. But when are we going to see some more Don Bentley penned thrillers?
Yeah, so I'm working on my first Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp book now, and the tradition is to release those in September. So it should be September of 2024, and then I'll work on something else. I'm not sure exactly what that is yet, but I still intend to continue my Matt Drake series and maybe throw a standalone in there as well.
Well, Don Bentley's newest is called Weapons Grade. It is his 4th Jack Ryan Jr. novel, following up Forgotten War, which is the latest Matt Drake thriller earlier this year. Don, I've taken a lot of your time today, but I really appreciate you talking about your career, how all this unfolds, and giving some of your fans a little peek behind your thought process and how you come up with such great thrillers. Thanks for this book. Thanks for all your work. And thanks for joining us on the One-on-One podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, John.
A big thank you to Don Bentley for taking time from his busy schedule to join us for this week's podcast interview. Look for his first Mitch Rapp book and his 5th thriller featuring his own original character, Matt Drake, sometime in 2024. You can follow Don and everything he has going on at donbentley.books.com. Now, before we go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Please follow or subscribe to the One-on-One with John Evans podcast on whatever app you use to listen to your favorite shows. And if you would be so kind, please leave us a rating or a review. We love to hear what you think of our interviews, and the more feedback we get from friends like you, the higher we'll be listed on the apps, the better chance we'll have of bringing in even more new listeners. I'm John Evans. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode of One-on-One.